everyone, and welcome to the Ivey Energy Policy and Management Center's 5th annual workshop on the economics of electricity policy and markets. My name is Bryant. I'm adjunct professor at Ivey, and I'll be the host of today's workshop. So for those of you new to the Ivey workshop series, the goal of our workshop is to bring together prominent scholars and practitioners from industry and government to share ideas and research on contemporary issues related to electricity policy, regulation, and electricity markets. Our hope is that by bringing these individuals together, we can build a community of academics and practitioners who are active in electricity policy. We can expand the network of researchers in Canada with an interest in electricity markets and electricity policies. And we can foster academic research that contributes to effective electricity policies and electricity market design. So each workshop is generally organized around a theme, and this year's theme is Electrification Futures. Today is the first of 4 panel sessions in the workshop and around this theme. And today's topic is Electrification Scenarios and Investment in Electricity Infrastructure. So before we begin the session, I'd first like to thank the Alberta Electric System Operator and the Independent Electricity System Operator of Ontario for their kind financial support of this workshop. I'd also like to thank Mr. Ted Kernahan and the Ivey Energy Consortium for their ongoing support of the workshop in general, including the research that we do and events like this. Furthermore, given that the Ivey Business School and Western University are situated on the traditional territories of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, the Nunapiwak, and Adawandron peoples, we'd like to recognize that this land continues to be home to a diverse Indigenous group of people whom we recognize as contemporary stewards of the land and vital contributors of our society. So we'd like to begin the workshop, and just as background, our workshop will run about an hour and 20 minutes. Each of our speakers will be given about 10 to 12 minutes to provide their thoughts on a particular matter related to the theme. And then we will open it up for questions, and we'd like to encourage a lot of questions from the audience. To manage the questions, what we will do is we will do 2 things. We will use the raise hand button. So if you'd like to ask a question, just raise your hand, and our moderator, who I'll introduce in a moment, will sign you in and you can ask your question live. Alternatively, if you'd like to use the Q&A button and write in a question, then our moderator will pose the question to the panel. So with that, let me introduce our moderator. Our moderator today is Adam Fremeth. He is the E.G. Kernahan Professor in Energy Policy at Ivey and an Associate Professor at Ivey. So with that, I turn it over to Adam. Thank you.
Hey, well, thanks so much, Brian. As Brian said, I'm Adam Fremeth, a professor here at Ivey, and excited to moderate the first panel in this series. We've got a great set of speakers who will each get about 10 to 12 minutes to talk about electrification scenarios and the necessary investment to get there, and then we'll open it to Q&A, as Brian mentioned, with the Q&A functionality, with you typing in, or alternatively raising your hand, and then I'll unmute you and we'll take questions by person. So if this is your first time joining our workshop, we generally like to pair together an academic, a policy person, and a manager. And today's panel fits that model really nicely. To start off, we'll have Normand Mousseau, who is a professor of physics at Université de Montréal and scientific director of the Institut de l'Énergie Tertiaire at Polytechnique Montréal. His work has been closely monitoring issues relating to energy and natural resources for more than a decade, and most recently, he is the co-author of the Canada Energy Outlook series, the second edition of which was just released, and which he'll be speaking about today. Next, we'll have Caroline Lee, who is the Senior Research Associate with the Canadian Institute for Climate Choices, an independent climate policy think tank. Before joining Climate Choices, she had worked at the International Energy Agency, the government of New Brunswick, and in energy consulting at Navius Research. Finally, we've got Tyler Bryant, who's the Low Carbon Policy and Strategy Manager at Fortis, BC. Tyler leads initiatives that will lead the transition for Fortis, BC to a low carbon future. He brings a multifaceted background on decarbonizing the energy system, having also worked at the IA, David Suzuki Foundation, and Natural Resources Canada. So please welcome all our panelists to today's session, and I'm going to pass it over to Norma.
Thank you very much. It's really a pleasure to be on this panel, really with distinguished people around me. So I will be indeed discussing today some electricity issues based on the work that we've done in this Canadian Energy Outlook, the second edition of which just appeared today. So you are the first crowd to have a official look at this outlook. Will be very short and very pointed in this presentation on electricity, but there's much wider things to be discussed, and I'll already do my advertisement and I'm done with it. So you can either find the outlook at the address above, and there's a webinar in French and in English this afternoon that will go and discuss it. So this work was done, the main author is Simon Langlois-Bertrand, and the modeling was led by Kathleen Vaillancourt from ESMIA Consulting. So let me move a bit on the modeling first, and then I'll get from this to the analysis really of the results. So the model by ESMIA is called NATEM. It's a times family model, and it's the most, I would say, technologically rich model available in Canada for the energy system. So it's really a fully systematic representation of the evolution of the system, with also all the other greenhouse gas emissions linked to processes, waste, etc., agriculture, etc. And it's very technologically explicit. There's thousands and thousands of technologies in it, with capital cost and results at the provincial level. So we've looked at 5 scenarios for this outlook. We have a reference scenario with all the policies in place today, and with the price of oil and gas and demand aligned with the Canada Energy Regulators Energy Future 2020 report. We have also a scenario where we considered carbon pricing up to $170 a ton, which was announced a few months ago. And we have 3 net zero scenarios, one with a net zero by 2060, another one in 2050, another one 2045, to really get an idea of what are the challenges for various sectors. The NZ50 is the one most closely aligned with the current government targets. So I will not talk about greenhouse gas emissions. It's really about electricity today. We have plenty of that, so you can look in the report. If we look at the transformation of the energy consumption, 2016 is the reference year, and then you see by 10 years, so 2030, 2040, 50, and 60, the evolution of the 5 scenarios. You see that we have a relatively conservative reference scenario that shows some growth in total energy consumption, about the 35% growth over the next 40 years or so in terms of energy consumption. You see also that as we impose net zero solution, the total energy consumption goes down. And it goes down for 2 reasons. One is because we reduce the energy production, especially oil and gas, and that reduces the energy demand on that side, but mostly because we see electrification. And electrification brings in, I would say, not energy efficiency, it's really energy productivity. Electricity is much more productive than heat for work. I mean, this we've known since Carnot in 1824, so the invention of thermodynamics is to tell us that as we move heat to work, there's always losses happening, and electricity is work, pure energy work, and that allows us to really decrease the total energy we consume without changing the service. And that's really what happens when you electrify wisely. I mean, if you just take electricity and just put it through a resistor to make heat, that's a very brutal way of using electricity, and that's not productive, but we have much better ways to do it. So,
Nomar, can I just interrupt and ask you if you could make your slides full screen so we could see it a little bit better? Is that possible?
Okay, I thought it was full screen. Okay. Yes, let me check again. Stop. Where's the stop here? Here, okay. Let me try try again. So if I do this here, I share, and then I do this. So is it full screen now?
It's a bit bigger than what it was before, but it,
Okay, so let me try a last time. And
yeah, otherwise we could just move forward.
okay, I don't know what's happening. And so if I do this here, and I try again. So how is it now?
Perfect, perfect.
Okay, well, sorry for that. So if we look at the electricity production, of course, as we transform the sector, it's nothing new. I mean, a lot of reports have been predicting this, including a nice report by the Canadian Institute for Climate Change that appeared earlier this year. Electricity will be at the core of the transition, of the energy transition. What we see is over the next 10 years is not so much an increase in energy in all the scenarios in electricity production, but more a decarbonization of the electricity production. So over the next 10 years, we see mostly a transformation of the inner electricity production. And then between 2030 and 2050, a significant increase in electricity consumption, mostly linked to decarbonization of sectors. So the more you have aggressive target for decarbonization, the more electricity you produce. And as you get net zero, all these scenarios essentially project the same, with the basis that remains what we have today, which is hydroelectricity, which is already in place. We don't project any new development of hydroelectricity because there's no plan in the books anywhere, so we include only those that are planned. We see a lot of wind because wind is well aligned with our demand, energy demand in Canada, mostly with the heat in the winter. Some sun. And also, depending on prices, depending on models, we might see some nuclear that could grow as a basis. So this is the tendency we see. We see that the demand in electricity will more than double over the next 30 years. But what is important to realize is that the transformation, the demand for electricity will not be uniform, and that will impose different demands on the electricity production and electricity network. One thing we see is that building heating should decarbonize almost fully and mostly build based on electricity. Electricity will be used for heating, mostly through heat pumps and other either direct air heat pumps, or you can also look at geothermal approaches. So that will decarbonize fully. Same thing for agriculture. Agriculture will still have considerable emissions due to the production of food, but all the transformation can be electrified. And we see that's a sector where we could expect a very considerable electrification over the next 3 decades. Industry will remain much more diverse. It's already very diverse in terms of energy sources because of the various needs, various processes and all. And you see that electricity will increase a bit, but essentially will remain only part of the full basket of energy sources for the industry. Finally, transport. Transport is a very difficult sector to decarbonize because technology is not fully present today. The solutions are not there on the market. Costs are still large, and also the kind of turnover is fairly slow. So what we see is that essentially by 2030, transportation will have led to fairly little increased demand in electricity, but whatever small demand in electricity increases a lot the productivity of energy in transport because using fossil fuel is so inefficient. So what we see is that even there's a bit of blue you might see in the middle, which is electricity, you still see a significant decrease in total energy consumption. And what we see is that still by 2050, about half only in fact, less than half of the energy consumed in the transport will be electricity. So what does that mean? And really, I wanted to keep this short, so that's really my last slide. So I'll want to spend some time on discussing this one. As I said, over the next 10 years, we don't see much increase in electricity production, mostly a switch in time of production, and then doubling over the next 20 years. That's a major. Doubling the energy production will require major investments rapidly. These investments are not only in the production side, they will have to be in line with the distribution, because you have to get this electricity to the people who demand it. And one of the things we see is that because building will grow so much in demand, that means that we have distribution to every single building in Canada will have to increase. So you have to have bigger wire, you have a bigger transformer, etc. So that really will mean major investments on the network. On the electricity side, on the industry side, you see that the increase is about only 50% in terms of proportion. Industry is also distributed across the territory, but much more in a much more punctual way. So getting the electricity to industry is not so demanding. Also, the pattern of demand for industry is typically very stable over the year. So answering the needs from industry is relatively easy with an increased production. Building is much more complicated because with building and also with agriculture, which I did not put here, you will have great variation over the years instead of demand. And also, if you think of agriculture, it means you need to really pull very heavy wire through the countryside. So those are expenses that will have to be borne and bared by all the society. You cannot just give this cost to the final user on this. Transportation is very slow to decarbonize, as I said, but still, electricity could represent up to 40% of the demand in transport in 2050. And depending on how this demand is positioned, it could also add considerably to the cost of developing the distribution infrastructure. If, for example, people recharge their car at work in downtown, which is already overloaded with wires, I mean, you will need much more capacity. If people do it at home, then it's possible to balance this with building heating and kind of reduce the variation in load that we have over the years. So this increase in electricity production, which is often the focus of these type of projection, hides a lot of the challenge. And the challenge means that we will have to build a network, transport and distribution network of electricity that can match the specific demand. And we'll have to play with demand, but also we'll have to ensure that we have this in place. And I would say today, there's still a lot of lack and a lot of missing bits on this type of projection. So I'll stop here. I'll remind you that we have webinars if you want to hear more about the outlook later today. Thanks.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Normand. That's a great kickoff to today's event and really helping to set the tone for the ongoing conversation. I'm going to pass it on now to Caroline, who's going to be speaking from another perspective on this. Caroline, over to you. And you have slides as well, so let's try and get them up.
Thanks, Adam. You probably see yourselves, don't you? Can you see my slides okay behind the screen here?
Yeah, if you want to just minimize the Zoom screen, then we can see them behind them. Yeah.
Okay. All right, thanks very much. Thanks for the invitation to speak today. I think electricity is such an important part of the net zero transition, so really welcome the opportunity to talk electricity here today. Just as a reminder, I'm representing the Canadian Institute for Climate Choices. And as Adam said, we are an independent think tank. We are federally funded. Our research agenda and our policy recommendations that we put out remain independent. So I think that's something that I want to remind everybody of. We're relatively new here on the scene. We were established just a couple of years ago. So we are kind of the new kids on the block in terms of climate-oriented think tanks. I don't have very many slides, so I'll try to be efficient in my remarks here. I basically have 3 points that I'd like to make. The first one, and I think these are probably going to align broadly with what you've heard from Normand, but I think the remarks that I'm going to make are likely going to be at a higher level. I'm going to look at electrification potential at a more macro level. So the first point I'd like to make is that widespread electrification, so electrification across a number of end uses in the economy, is what we see consistent with the achievement of net zero goals. So what we did last year, we released a report earlier in February of this year, is we undertook an analysis to understand how Canada can meet its net zero goals. And we analyzed 60 plus net zero scenarios for Canada to achieve that ambitious target. And so as part of that exercise, what we wanted to also do is look at, okay, not only what do our results say, but what do other studies that model deep decarbonization and net zero targets, what do they say about the role of electricity in a net zero future? So this is the figure that you see here in front of you. It shows you electricity as % share of total consumption. So what you see here, I realize the font is quite small. In 2015, if you look at this little teal circle, in 2015, just less than a quarter of our total energy consumption, final consumption, was comprised of electricity here in Canada. This black one is the US dot. And then what we did down here is in 2050, we looked at a whole bunch of different studies, including one from Normal. This was before, of course, the new one is going to be launched. So we'll want to update this based on the new work that he's done. What we see is that, you know, all of the studies project a much higher share of electricity in final consumption. I think that's clear. So we go from about 23 to anywhere between, you know, 48 to 66%. Of total consumption share. The range that you see here is from our own analysis. So as I said earlier, we looked at 60 plus scenarios. So this range actually represents the range of outcomes across those scenarios. So of course it's very, very wide. I will say that the scenarios down here on the lower end, so where we see electricity representing a smaller share of final total consumption, that's where we have made assumptions about deployment of technologies that we call wildcards. So in particular, these lower end scenarios are characterized by a situation where we see technologies like negative emissions technologies, things like direct air capture, things that have potentially a lot of potential, but really uncertain prospects at this stage. These things work out in a really big way in this lower end of the range. And as a result, we see electricity comprising a lower share of total final consumption. So, you know, if these things don't come to bear, then it's likely that electricity will become a higher share of total final consumption is what we see. So really the general takeaway here is that if you electrify, that's generally in alignment with and consistent with achievement of net zero goals. Point number 2 is that, so while we see electricity demand growing, then we also see a commensurate increase in the size of the electricity system. So, you know, Normal had already showed this in his slides previously. We see demand growth over time, and as a result, electricity generation and then also capacity growth increases in a commensurate manner. Now, of course, the increase in electricity demand isn't just being driven by the fuel switching to electricity, although that's a real key driver in what we see. We also see economic growth and population growth also driving rising electricity demand. So the 2 graphs that you see in front of you here show projections of electricity generation on the left and installed capacity across some key net zero studies, including the one that Norman just presented, actually. That's right. So in these various net zero studies across Canada, where do they see electricity generation and installed capacity over time? So, you know, the trajectory is pretty clear. We see an increase in electricity generation. What you see in the kind of opaque bars is the minimum across the studies, and then the light bar shows the maximum across the studies here. So generation increases anywhere between, you know, 1.5 to 2.5 times from today. And then capacity rather increases quite a lot more. This is mostly because we see an increased share of variable renewables in the system. So especially wind, but also solar, which run on lower capacity factors. So you simply need more capacity of these types of energy sources to generate the same amount of electricity as you would for fossil fuels. So, we see much bigger capacity additions and much higher total installed capacity in a 2050 world to enable this higher electricity demand driven in part by electrification. So, a couple of things here, the takeaway from this graph might be, okay, well, we just need to be building out. I want to add a couple of caveats here. We don't want to be building out the system for the sake of building out the system, for the sake of growing it. I think we also need to be prioritizing aggressive energy efficiency improvements. We need to be prioritizing demand side flexibility. So, smoothing our demand peaks, moving demand away to off-peak times to reduce capacity needs. And also thinking about, where we can maximize to the extent possible interregional transmission. So enhancing the coordination and trade of electricity across regions, that also can really help reduce our capacity needs. So we didn't be increasing our capacity, but in an efficient and cost-effective way. What we see basically across these studies that we've analyzed is that even if you take into account aggressive energy efficiency improvements, a lot of demand side flexibility, and a lot more interregional transmission, we still see supply growing in a net zero world. That's why we say electrification is consistent also with growing the electricity system. And then the third point is really, what does this mean? So, here on the right-hand side, you see some screenshots that I've taken of 4 technical scoping papers that we have commissioned to look at some of these issues for an ongoing project on electricity that I'll talk about in my last slide here. But some of these findings that I'm presenting here in this slide are drawn from those scoping papers that you see. So, what are the policy implications? How are we actually to enable electrification? One thing that we've seen is that we have kind of inconsistent targets and mandates for net zero, yes, but also electrification across various levels of decision-making bodies. So, for example, a utility might have a certain EV adoption target that's not necessarily consistent with the target of the provincial government, and then also in turn not necessarily coherent with the federal target. So enhancing that coherence and that alignment across levels of government and then across utilities and regulators it could be an important step. The second thing is to strengthen the carbon pricing signal. So, we now have a broad coverage carbon price in Canada, really great. There are, of course, ways in which this carbon price policy, in particular, the output-based approach, so the OBPS, as it applies to large industry, could be strengthened. I'm not going to go into the details of that, but the way in which we treat, for example, electricity generation is not necessarily consistent across different electricity generators. Also, we could think about, declining the benchmark over time to make sure that it's consistent with net zero goals. So those types of things to ensure that we have a clear, long-term, predictable carbon price signal to support electrification and other net zero aligned measures. The third thing is kind of obvious. We can adopt targeted policies for electrification, things like, EV subsidies. We know these things. We don't see a lot of measures to support, for example, heat pump adoption. And we also don't see a very kind of coordinated or aligned approach across the country. So, all of us across this country probably know that some provinces offer certain subsidies for EV adoption, some don't. So there is a kind of misalignment there, and that means that the policy signal is a bit muddied nationally. And then the last point here is that, we can think also about pursuing greater integration, not only with regards to consistency between utilities and governments or regulators and governments, but also across sectors and across demand and supply. So, one example here is that if we're thinking about supporting the adoption of heat pumps in homes, we also want to be really thinking about how we can make that new source of load flexible. So it's not just about adding new sources of demand, but making sure that that demand is flexible so that we're not inadvertently, increasing peak demand in an inefficient way that requires additional unneeded capacity additions. So thinking about, as we're pursuing electrification, as we're pursuing net zero goals, thinking about how demand and supply can work together. So, to end off here on my very last slide, just want to mention a project that I had alluded to earlier that we're working on just now on aligning broader electricity systems in Canada with net zero goals. The way that we're thinking about this project is really along two lines. So first of all, it's the what needs to change. In what ways do Canada's electricity systems need to transform in order to support net zero goals? So we're going to try to define the what in one component of this project. And then we're going to dig into the how. So what does that mean? We're going to think about the key barriers that are impeding transformation. So impeding these changes that we need, be they market barriers, policy barriers, social technical barriers, and then also go on to recommending a key set of policies and interventions to address these. So it'll be, in part technical, the analysis, but also in part policy oriented. Out of scope of this project is actually policies directly targeting electrification, which I know is the topic of today's session, but we do think about how we can broadly enable electrification to align with net zero. So if that's something you're interested in, keep your eye out next spring. We hope to be releasing this analysis then. And I will end it here. Thanks.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Caroline. Lots of interesting work that's going on in this space, clearly. And the nice thing about coming from these issues at a business school and types of panels we bring together is, well, I'd love to hear what a utility firm would have to say about this. And luckily enough, we've got Tyler at Fortis, BC, who's going to be coming on now to offer some insight from that perspective. So Tyler, I'll pass it on to you.
Thanks, Adam. It wouldn't be a panel without sharing some slides, so let me do that. And while I can't do two things at one time, so just bear with me here. Okay, here we go. Is that beaming through to your living room? Hope so.
Yeah, looking great, Tyler.
Great. Okay. So howdy, folks. Thanks for having me, and thank you to Norma and Caroline for opening up an interesting conversation. And as Adam was saying, so my name is Tyler, and I work for a rather large utility, at least in terms of Canadian sizes. So Fortis, BC. Let me just get into this here. So I work for basically a integrated gas and electric utility, but primarily a gas utility. So what we see here on the map is the blue area is our natural gas service territory, as we like to say in the utility speak, and the little yellowish area is our electric service territory, and they kind of overlap. So we provide both gas and electric in that shaded yellow area. And we've been an electric utility for quite a long time, actually. So, for over 100 years. I think, don't quote me on this, but I think we own the oldest hydroelectric dam in Canada, if not North America, in our Upper Bonington facility on the Columbia River. And that's a very cool facility. It's very steampunk with big, levers and switches and all that type of stuff. And so yeah, I'll be talking to you from the perspective of both a gas and electric utility. Just to give you the breakdown, it's about 9-to-1 in terms of the relative sizes of our gas rate base to our electric rate base, or to our electric customers, gas to electric customers, and gas to electric regulated capital. So, and so as a large utility, we have been thinking pretty hard about, what are we going to do and what is our plan to align with the provincial governments and the federal governments, both short and long-term greenhouse gas reduction goals. And that's what I wanted to talk to you today about. So as you may understand, we're definitely supportive of electrification can talk, at length about that. But as a utility with a duty to serve that's kind of enshrined in legislation here in the province, we also have to be incredibly mindful of those more, I guess, traditional table stakes for a utility, which is reliable, safe, affordable energy delivery to British Columbians. Because as we know, energy is really the thing that makes everything else go hum. And if we're not delivering that energy reliably and affordably, the rest of the artifice kind of tends to collapse. So as I like to think about our decarbonization challenge, it really is that trilemma. How do we march forward our low carbon goals along with our goals to strengthen or maintain the resiliency of our all above energy system? And then also, how do we moderate the affordability impacts? Because as we're seeing, neither one of those three pegs or legs of the stool can get too much in front of the other before the other two will pull the other one back. And so if you want to be too affordable, for example, then, actually what you would have a situation similar to kind of what we saw transpire in say Texas, for example. They they basically built a system that was primarily or single-mindedly focused on affordability, and they sacrificed obviously the resiliency of that system, and they sacrificed moving that system to become more low carbon. If you advance a system that's more low carbon, then the affordability, kind of what we're seeing transpire, say in gas markets in Europe, is that they will the other factors will kind of pull those ambitions back. And so that's the perspective we bring. We definitely want to kind of align with our net zero goals, but it is going to be a massive challenge, and that's what I wanted to maybe shed some light on. So just a little bit more on Fortis BC. We're basically investing in significant activity to reduce emissions in British Columbia right now. So we're one of Canada's largest private investors in energy efficiency. In 2022, we will invest $100 million actually in energy efficiency as part of our regulated capital, and so that's basically a tripling of energy efficiency investment from about 4 years ago. We've offered renewable gas for 10 years. In fact, last week we celebrated our 10-year anniversary of the voluntary renewable gas program. We were the first utility in North America to actually offer a renewable gas program, and we've been offering that. We were way out in front. The next one came along only 2 or 3 years ago, so we've had a long experience with that. In our electric service territory, we have deployed a network of 40 public fast chargers, so all over the southern interior. And just 2 weeks ago, actually, we celebrated our 10,000th public charging event. And just to give you a sense of like exponential growth, so that it took us about 3 years to get to 10,000, and we think we're going to get to 20,000 next year. So big deal. And of course, we are here at Tidewater, and we have the lowest carbon LNG facility in the world, actually. And there's large opportunities for Fortis BC to provide LNG to really difficult to decarbonize sectors such as the international marine transport sector. So Vancouver Fraser Port Authority is the second busiest port in North America. And so there's about 6,000 port calls per year coming into Vancouver Fraser ports, and we could use LNG to basically make a sizable dent, but a 25% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions if some of those vessels, or if those vessels converted their powertrains over to a gaseous powertrain. So that's kind of what we're up to. Picking up a bit on Chris, the previous comment that utilities need to kind of align with the provincial goals. So that's what we've ideally done. So we've set a 30 by 30 target, which would commits us to reducing greenhouse gas emissions from our customers. So from all the fuel we deliver, basically, and the combustion of that fuel by 30% by 2030. And actually, we're going to likely step that ambition up even further. And so how are we going to do that? Well, it's going to be through all these actions and then some. We're actually uncovering even more different greenhouse gas mitigation opportunities. And so we'll add all that up, and that'll be about a 4 million ton reduction, which is incredibly significant. This is one of the most ambitious greenhouse gas reduction targets for a gas primary utility in the world, in fact. And we're proud of kind of making this commitment, and we're actually committing to do even more. So to give you a sense of kind of where we're at, or how much activity is going on. So this is just an outlook of our renewable gas supply portfolio. So to give you a sense, Fortis BC delivers about 200 petajoules of gas per year. And so right now we have less than 1% of that is renewable gas. But as you see, we have we're basically getting to 5% in the next 2 years. These are all committed agreements approved by the regulators. So that supply is basically coming online. We've went from 4 renewable gas projects 18 months ago to 20 projects today, and we have an additional 20 in the hopper. So we have a very clear line of sight to get to about 30 petajoules, which would be a 15% blend target for our entire system. What is 30 petajoules, you're asking? That's a good question. I didn't know what a petajoule was either before I joined Fortis BC. But to give you a sense of scale, 30 petajoules is approximately 30 petajoules of kind of renewable gas or clean energy is approximately 60% more energy than would be generated by the new Site C dam here in British Columbia. So it is, in fact, a huge injection of clean energy into BC's energy system in the next 10 years. 60% more than the 20-something billion dollar dam that the provincial government is building. So that's kind of our activities, our short-term activities. Now looking out to the long-term, more so what the other speakers were discussing. So we've also done, some detailed analysis, detailed evaluations of, how do we get to our deep decarbonization goals as a gas and electric utility. And one of the things that we're very mindful of, as I was just kind of saying, we've operated in the province for about 100 years. We like to think that we
Oui, ça va. Oui.
Je pense demande vous devez yeah, there we go. And what we really are concerned about here is that BC, Canada, all the different individual provinces are idiosyncratic places. They have their own particularities, their own specific energy systems, and we really need to develop made in BC or from wherever you are, made in Ontario type of solutions, because it's a lot of solutions have been developed in different jurisdictions, and then they are transposed on top of other jurisdictions. And in fact, once you take a close look, it actually doesn't work nearly as well. So what's different about BC and even about the other provinces? Well, we have basically a clean power sector here already. So that is great news from an actual greenhouse gas emission perspective. That means for the past 6 decades that we've built out this hydroelectric power system, we've avoided all those emissions. But that power system is actually incredibly unique. So there's only 3 other jurisdictions in the world, Manitoba, Quebec, and Norway, that have a hydroelectric dominated power system like BC does. And so we need to take that into account when we think about how are we going to decarbonize our energy economy, is that we've taken a very viable sector by which to decarbonize from off the table, right? So you build solar or wind here in BC and it actually doesn't reduce your emissions one bit, just to be oversimplified about it. So that makes the intensity to abate, that makes the challenge that much more stringent on the remaining emitting sectors. We need to take that into consideration. BC also has immense potential for other renewable energy carriers. So, we have a large renewable energy potential. That's just basically a function of land area, and BC is a fairly large place. We have some of the lowest carbon natural gas reserves in the world. Maybe those could be used potentially to create hydrogen. And we have a very large biomass resource, biomass waste. So to give you a sense of things, BC's forestry sector is on a shared basis 5 times larger than a place like California, for example, in terms of share of our provincial economy. And so maybe that has some type of role we can play to maybe produce other clean energy carriers, clean energy fuels. And finally, we have, relatively speaking, not to the rest of Canada, but to other kind of leading climate jurisdictions, quite a large winter heating load. And we'll see that that kind of really matters. So just very quickly, we looked at two different pathways. We did some analysis that said, okay, let's develop a straw dog for an electrification pathway, and let's do a different pathway that what we call the diversified pathway. And just very quickly, the diversified pathway keeps a meaningful role for the gas delivery infrastructure. So FortisBC owns about 50,000 kilometers of gas delivery infrastructure. And we said, keep the load on the gas system the same in 2050 as it is today, but achieve an 80% greenhouse gas reduction goal. And so we see here there's a lot going on here, but the main thing is that, on energy efficiency, you need to basically pull your energy efficiency lever as hard as you can in either scenario. Like it's basically you got to work from the ground up, and energy efficiency is the lowest, hanging fruit, so to speak. In fuel switching, you can, in the electric pathway, you go to 100% electric heating, kind of what Normand was showing. And in the diversified pathway, there's still fuel switching to electricity, but there's also fuel switching to renewable gas, significant fuel switching to renewable gas as well. In transportation, both passenger vehicle fleets go 100% electric. That's uncontroversial. There's still kind of a really up in the air question on what is the low carbon solution for our medium and heavy duty transport fleets, which are turning out to be like, the bigger issue. They're going to exceed passenger vehicle emissions, or if they haven't already in some provinces, they will into the future. And it's a much more of an open question. So in this, the electric vehicle, electrification pathway, they obviously go to a battery electric type of technology, and then the diversified pathway to go to gaseous powertrain or a fuel cell powertrain. And there we see there, this is aligned, I believe, with what Caroline and Normand we're showing. We go from about 20% of final energy share for electricity today to 37% in the diversified pathway, and almost half in the electrification pathway. So what happens is that when we put those into the model and we take the utility perspective on things, is that we uncover some pretty significant challenges. So and they both orbit this issue, which is heat, peak heat, actually. So FortisBC as a gas delivery company basically is in the business of providing heat. Okay, so nobody consumes a cubic meter of natural gas for the hell of it. They consume it to produce heat, either in industrial applications, industrial kilns and furnaces, or for our home, for space heating. And the thing about heat is, I don't think anybody really fully knows the scale of how large heat demand is. So did you know that here in BC, almost half of all the energy we consume is for heat, either in industrial applications or for our buildings? So it's by far the largest energy end use. It's larger than 10 percentage points larger than all the energy we put into our cars and trucks, for example, to move around. So it's an immense energy system. And so if we're going to decarbonize it, obviously we have a challenge. So this is a day in the life on the FortisBC system. We see here that this is a summer day, so we're delivering about 10 terajoules an hour. That's equivalent to about 3,600 megawatts of generating capacity. I'll just quickly go through this because I know I'm running short on time. The point here is that heat demand is obviously very peaky. So you only need heat when you need it, when it gets cold, right? So the gas system is basically built to store incredible amounts of energy to deliver seasonally when we need it. It's built operationally, it's also built financially. So the gas system can go relatively fallow at different points of the year and still be solvent and still, operate very well. And so what we see there is that in January 2020, we had the second highest peak day on our system ever. So we were delivering over 60 terajoules an hour, which is equivalent to about 18,000 megawatts of generating capacity. That's 60% more peak than the actual peak output of BC's electricity system. So the point here is, if we're going to decarbonize this energy with electricity, it needs to be built out to withstand this peak. Because as we saw in the Texas situation, it's not good enough to have a system that's not resilient to peak heat events. You know, it's basically a personal security issue. Right? You need to deliver heat. People depend on it, right? It's definitely a safety issue. It's an issue for your economy. Okay, so if we're going to deliver that with electricity, then we would need approximately 9,000 megawatts of new, clean, firm capacity here in British Columbia. So we add up all the drivers for electrification, we add up all the EVs, all the electrified industry, and all the electric heat pumps, and we find we need to build out our provincial electricity system by about 2/3 again. So that's a huge challenge. That's equivalent to about 6 new Site C dams. And the thing is, the important word there is firm. So this is not necessarily about wind and solar. This is about energy that you can depend on when you need it. Key thing about that day, by the way, in January 2020, is that they coincide with kind of low pressure events that come down from the Arctic, which coincides with low variable wind output. So on that day, of the 3,000 megawatts of installed wind that was available in Alberta, 9 was producing on that day. So it's not good enough to have just wind. This is the utility perspective. You need to have dependable energy. We did some analysis with University of Victoria. This is some separate analysis that kind of looked at this. And what the key thing here is, I'd like to just show you on the bottom chart, is the amount of energy capacity and storage you might need. We did a bunch of different scenarios and said you might need anywhere from 0 energy storage to 360 something gigawatt hours of energy storage. So that's more than all the utility battery storage installed combined in the United States right now. And that's just to decarbonize BC's system. That'd be equivalent to about, that giant container ship that blocked up the Suez Canal? That'd be the equivalent of about 7 of those container ships packed with batteries sitting in the Bryant Inlet. And so we see on the right here, here's what happens if your wind and solar isn't working. You see on the right, we'd need upwards of 400 gigawatt hours of batteries to get through a 5-day cold event if our variable renewable resources were not operating. So there's no free lunch in decarbonization, and the thing is, well, if we're not going to electrify, or if we can't depend on electrification, if it's too challenging, then what else can pick up the load? And so we looked at renewable gases, and the thing about renewable gases is that they can use the existing gas system. They can use basically the incredibly cheap storage already baked in to the gas system. So to give you a sense, the gas system can store a kilowatt hour of energy at 0.02 cents per kilowatt hour. Battery electric system is $180 per kilowatt hour. So it's incredibly cheap to use the gas system for storage, but we need the clean energy in the gas system. That's the challenge, right? And so here we see the renewable gas issue. We would need basically to switch the gas system over in BC to 75% renewable gases in the next 30 years. So that'd be a huge expansion of renewable gases. And that would be, I can talk at length about that, but it would be a mix of biomethane and of course, hydrogen, which is what everybody is talking about. So I've spent a lot of time here. I'm sorry, Adam, but kind of got rolling. Obviously, from the utility perspective, an integrated utility perspective, we think the diversified approach is a more practical approach. It does achieve the 80% reduction. It's actually $100 billion less costly. It considers the key kind of operational limitations that a utility considers. It strengthens your reliability and resiliency. It's really kind of, as we go on this journey to net zero, it's really not electrification or something else. It's really, how do we leverage all of our energy infrastructure? It's both and. How do we leverage gas, electric, what have you, to get to our long-term goals? So I thank you for your attention, and I'll pass it back to Adam.
Great. Well, thanks so much, Tyler. We've had quite a few questions come in through the Q&A, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to start by taking up a few of the ones that have come in from there, but also encourage everyone to also, either use the Q&A or also use the raise hand function in Zoom, and we could just have the attendees ask the questions of the panel as well. Okay, so I'm going to start off with a question that has strung along a number of the points that have come up in the Q&A, and also something that I think is always out there on this issue, and that's the one around transportation, right? Which is always seen as one of the key obstacles to getting to net zero. What's some of the most difficult aspects of changing the system. And so Steve Baker raised the question around some of the policies we've seen in the world and that have been bandied about here as well, around the banning of internal combustion engines, right? And so I'd like to hear from the panel a bit about how this plays into the transition from your view, and those of you that have done projections and tried to play with the numbers. How does that option work into what you've done? Who'd like to start? Norman, I saw you unmuted yourself already. So
yeah. So the point is that in the type of models we do, we have to assess what's the cost, the evolution cost, and the available technologies. And these various ZEV mandates around the world have kind of played a big role in changing this aspect and reducing costs and increasing the number of models. So, for example, the one in Canada, which has not been, it's not law, it's not even detailed, so it's not in our model, but the whole movement around the world accelerate this transformation. So it's kind of chicken and egg. At one point, you have to start moving to convince the car manufacturer that they have to design these cars, they have to start building, they have to abandon others. And all this technology will trickle up or trickle side or whatever you want to other transportation sectors. Because if batteries are cheaper, well, it will be easier to try them. So those are important policies, even though by the time they get there, it's self-fulfilling prophecy. So by the time you get to 2035, they will be useless, but they are useful 15 years ahead.
Caroline?
Yeah, maybe what I would just add is that, I think this question points to how we should probably distinguish between passenger transport and then medium and heavy duty transport. So, when we think about the ICE ban, that applies to passenger cars and trucks, and it is consistent with what we see in our net zero analysis as aligning with net zero goals. So we basically see passenger transport electrifying in a major way to 2050. And banning ICE vehicles in transport is consistent with that, including implementing a ZEV to actually get that done. So I think that all makes good sense. When it comes to medium and heavy duty, our analysis has shown that electrification of that subsector could be quite important, but biofuels can also play an important role, hydrogen, and also simply, energy efficiency. So making these kinds of vehicles more efficient and better urban planning, these kinds of things. So let's distinguish the subsector in transport. I think it's important.
I think that's a great point. Tyler?
Yeah, I mean, just from reflection on, so I spent a lot of my time thinking about medium and heavy duty because Fortis BC serves, we support about a fleet of 1,200 medium and heavy duty fleet vehicles, so trucks and that type of stuff with compressed natural gas, and even some of them are consuming renewable natural gas. Is their load profile is significantly different than passenger vehicles. So we talk about how, well, the peak impacts of EVs may not be so bad. We could move that charging into the middle of the night. We could use smart chargers, time of use pricing, what have you. The thing is with fleet vehicles is their duty cycles are pretty tight. And so when they need to charge, right? They have, they deliver on a kind of an 8-hour schedule. They come into base and they need to be ready for the next morning or what have you. And so they're much less responsive to those type of price signals. And they could have a very important, in fact, in the analysis that I just showed, they have a much higher impact on the peak than passenger vehicles. And so electrifying them will be incredibly challenging. I've worked with colleagues at UVic here. We have a paper forthcoming on this, but it could be as much as 2/3 of all of the electricity generation in the province could go just to the heavy duty transport sector if we electrify it fully. So it's just a huge challenge in terms of how we're going to do that.
Normand, did you want to respond to that?
Yeah, I mean, that looks to me a lot of energy. That's not what we feel when we look at the energy of these transport. Because first, electric engines are much more efficient. So you gain a lot in terms of energy. It's also, I just want to come back to one point which I did not mention, but what we find is that having net zero goals changes fully how we have to tackle the problem. Net zero goal cannot be achieved by 20% reduction here, 20% reduction there, 20% there. You have to make sure you decarbonize fully a maximum of sectors, because there's a few places where it's very hard to decarbonize and we'll have to do sequestration, but we cannot do it for the whole of the economy. And that means that you have to reverse thinking and say, okay, that's the goal, that's what we have to achieve, and then align what's needed to get there. Not simply say, oh, that's tough to do this, that's tough to do that, I will not do it. And it's been done in the past. We've seen some major transition taking place this way. And that's really, we have to change the mindset if we want to achieve the goals that have been legislated at the moment.
Okay, so I think following along with this, I'm thinking about legislate goals, and this is my perhaps Ontario focus on things. Perhaps we had a point in the Q&A that was brought up by Jeff Parnell around the further adoption of variable technologies, wind and solar, and brings me back to a comment I heard from a CEO of a very large American utility once that said, if you like wind, you gotta love gas. Okay, and so if we're looking in a transition away from gas, looking at the numbers that you show, Normand, how do we get it to the adoption of some of these variable technologies effectively and within the time span of, let's say, the next 20 years?
I mean, storage. You need storage at one point. Energy storage, either under heat or as pure electricity. So either as battery, chemical storage, or heat. But there's no way out of that. In Canada, we benefit from the fact that we already have huge storage distributed across the country in Newfoundland, Quebec, Manitoba, BC. So with the right transport line and across the provinces, you could lower significantly the cost of these technologies and the risk associated with these technologies. But if we all think of this in silos, it will not work. And no, I'm conflict of interest. I'm involved with the Transition Accelerator, where we have something called Canada Grid project that we're putting together that just pushes this type of integration to make sure we can get to this type of, to benefit, to make use of these great benefits we have in Canada.
Anyone else want to sort of respond to that? The challenges of variable technology, the necessity to bring on storage. Was it 7 tankers of storage batteries, or even Paul Herrick's also in the Q&A had brought up how do we get to this interregional transmission as an alternative? Caroline, I see you unmuted.
Yeah, I mean it's a good question, and it's an emerging question too. We see countries around the world are seeing higher shares of VRE, even in the absence of net zero goals, right? Because they're becoming cheaper, they're becoming cost competitive with thermal generation sources. So it's a challenge for electricity systems globally outside of the climate challenge. But I responded to Jeff in the chat here, but I think first of all, I totally agree with Normand that actually, our rich endowment of hydro is actually a real asset here. First of all, because it actually means that if we're going to meet net zero, we don't actually need to get to the super duper high shares of variable renewables that some countries need to get to because they've got a whole bunch of fossil in their existing mixes. And then secondly, that hydro can be used for flexibility. So it's dispatchable, it's clean, especially if you enhance transmission across regions, then you can use it. Manitoba can share the wealth with Saskatchewan, for example. So I think having hydro in Canada is really great. Having high shares of VRE is not a deal breaker. I mean, we've seen this in electricity systems around the world now that operate well-functioning electricity systems with high shares of solar and wind. So, I mean, you do that with, yes, some dispatchable sources and potentially, yes, some thermal sources. So you can keep some gas capacity in there, not run it at very high capacity factors. And then there you go, that can help you with your peaking. That's fine. We've seen that also. Nobody's talking about necessarily 100% VRE systems, but then you can also, increase the transmission across your regions. Think about storage. Think about demand side flexibility. I mean, that's also something that's really critical, I think, to helping enhance the entire flexibility of the system. So I think it's just about kind of reorienting our thinking around what electricity systems look like rather than base load versus peaking. It's about a flexible system that accommodates high shares of VRE.
Okay, great. Thanks, Tyler. Any take on that from your perspective?
Yeah, I mean, we should be pretty sober about the storage need, right? Like it is immense, and it is much larger than the existing hydro capacity we have in the province or in Canada. So we will need technological breakthroughs and some incredibly ambitious build out of storage options. And what I showed you, I mean, if you don't want 7 gigawatts of batteries, so that's kind of an extreme scenario, but just to punctuate it, then it's 25 pump storage facilities in the province, right? And I don't think also we should over-egg the custard too much on the transmission ability. Just what was it, 3 weeks ago or something, BC Hydro released their IRP, which showed that actually they're going to be in a system capacity deficit by 2026, meaning that they'll need a transmission line to serve them. One of the deep suspicions I have, so we're involved in the WEC, which is the Western Electricity Corridor. This is basically the WEC region is the large interconnect on the west coast of North America here. One of my deep suspicions is that each utility in that consortium, in that planning group, thinks it's going to be importing power from each other to get the net zero goals. And so, in fact, I know that to be true. So we need more than just transmission capacity. We need to basically solve this energy storage issue with quite a clear-eyed view of how much we would need and what that stack of technologies looks like.
Yeah, I mean, just a couple of thoughts along that. I mean, you see the hot summers in Washington, Oregon, the brownouts in California. That's what you're talking about there in that region, Tyler. And then, on the pump storage side, we see TC Energy trying to roll out pump storage, a very large pump storage program here in Ontario, and how long it will actually take, perhaps, for them to get there, despite the necessity for us to build that. And Tyler, you want to respond to that as well?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like I'm just throwing out little stats, but I showed that chart which said, the gas system's delivering 60% more energy than the maximum output of the provincial electricity system. Well, it gets way worse when you look at a place like Ontario, right? That actually had, like, I lived in Ottawa. I know what that cold, I guess Caroline is in Ottawa right now, but like that cold winter is no joke. And the amount of peak energy that the Enbridge system delivers is about 4 to 5 times greater on their peak day than the provincial electricity system delivers on its summer peak day. Like 4 to 5 times, right? So how does that gap get filled up? It's a huge challenge. I guess that's what I'm just trying to emphasize, is this is much more than we need to build out variable renewables. Like, we have a massive challenge on our hands.
I mean, if I look in Quebec, I mean, I have difficulties squaring these numbers, because between the winter and summer, there's about 2.5 times difference in energy peak for electricity, and a large part of our building is already electrified. So the numbers you're giving to me appear much higher than what I would expect looking at the numbers in Quebec, where we've lived with electric heating for about 40 years now. It's not 100%, but it's fairly sizable. And so I kind of don't see how these numbers can match in Ontario, for example. It cannot be 3 or 4 times what the peak in electricity demand. It doesn't make sense. So you're talking about 2, 2.5. It's a lot, but it's manageable.
I guess we'll see. I know, Tyler, if you want to get that, I'd like to take some questions. We're starting to get a few hands here, and I could see a couple of people that I think have, particular positions or informed positions on this. I'm going to start off with Julia McNally. I'm going to, see how well this Zoom functionality works. I'm going to allow her to talk, and she's going to join our conversation. Look at that. Julia, I'm going to pass it over to you. I'm going to ask you to unmute.
I'm sorry, and I hate to lunch bag letdown. If my hand was up, it was up in error, but this is a fascinating conversation.
Okay. All right. Well, I'm going to move over. I see Steve Baker has his hand up. I'm going to allow Steve Baker to talk on this one. Here, I'm going to allow you to talk, Steve, and ask you to unmute.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
So this was just really a response to, I think, the dialogue that Tyler and Normand were having, because we did the analysis in Ontario, and I would agree that when you try to convert peak day gas to peak day electric, you would need a 3 to 4 times build out of the peak electric system. And I think the difference between Quebec is that Quebec currently has a lot of winter heat that is already electrified just based on their system, whereas in Ontario, the vast majority, like 90% of winter heating peak requirements are natural gas today. So if you're going to electrify all of that, Ontario is starting from a very different position than Quebec, in that it has so much of its winter peak satisfied by natural gas. So I think, just to give perspective, I think that's why, the numbers, comparing Ontario to Quebec seem so large, but the analysis has been done by a number of different agencies. And, I think, the Ontario system is about 3,000 or 30,000 megawatts. And to convert that into that peak day into all electric, you need about another 90,000 megawatts of electric. So it's sizable. And I think that's the issue that I think we're going to grapple with practically as we go forward here. Not to say that there's not lots of great ways to decarbonize and to use electricity to offset natural gas heating, but this peak day issue, and I think you're seeing it in California and over in Europe, this peak day issue is one that we're going to have to get our minds around, I would think.
Any comments on the work I guess Steve had done? Yeah, Tyler.
Just to say, so I don't want to appear like I'm being the heel here and saying we don't need to decarbonize. I'm saying we need to understand what the real operational challenges are going to be, especially from the perspective of a utility who's basically holding the bag to make sure that that happens, right? That we are responsible at the end of the day for people's energy delivery needs. And it's simply just not good enough to kind of hope that it's going to work out. It needs to be built out very clear-eyed on how it's going to happen. And we saw, like I said, when a peak heat event hits you, it is such a large, blocky, peaky type of energy demand. We really did see kind of in that Texas situation. There's lots of tongue wagging about what all went wrong in Texas. But just to say that system was just basically not built to handle a peak heat event, and the entire thing collapsed. And so that, in Ontario in the winter or what have you, that's just simply not good enough when the temperatures get that low.
As someone who has a co-author in Austin, I heard what it was like, in those periods of time when it got very cold and they just don't have anything to back up, people living in their offices, right? I've got a question here from David Marshall. And so to give it a little bit of context as well, Canada's a small open economy, right? We're definitely not an island here. And the US is, and has been using its, shale gas resources to reduce its carbon mix, right? And so it'd be interested to hear how some of the studies that you guys have been working on and thoughts around, how much we need to be aligning with the US on these types of net zero plans.
I think the way we look at this is we look at what's the plan, and then the modeling is to say, no, that's the plan, the federal objectives, how do we meet them? One of the issue, of course, is in Canada, 80% of the electricity is already low carbon or decarbonized. And so that's a big difference with the US. So all the challenge, no, we cannot close that many coal plants and move them to gas plant and to decrease emissions in this sector, because there's not much left. So it's, I think that's really the difference. If we want to move on this decarbonization, we have to move on the service and electrify service, while of course increasing electricity, but there's not much space left to decarbonize electricity today.
Anyone else? Caroline, how do you guys think about the relationship with the US and the trading, obviously, in energy that goes on between us?
Oh, yeah, in our net zero analysis, we considered different scenarios of kind of differential climate action outside of Canada, including the US. We also represented trade relationships with the US, so natural gas in particular, oil, to kind of look at the implications of acting in concert, acting in isolation, those kinds of things. If we are a small open economy, yes, that's very true. I think with regards to oil and gas in particular, what we saw is that, what happens in the US in terms of US oil and gas demand for Canada's exports has real implications for the for kind of maintaining and sustaining oil and gas production in Canada. That was very clear. So in a way, it's like, what happens outside our borders is actually more important in determining the fate of oil and gas in a net zero world, because it does rely on kind of external international oil and gas demand. But I would also say, in a broader sense, what happens in the US, in a way, like Canada can do things on its own, and we'll be, we can be fine in some respects too. I think about, when the Trump administration was elected, fair to say, not a climate progressive federal administration in the US, and yet Canada managed to do things in a way that were really not in lockstep with the US. We implemented all kinds of climate policies, including quite a stringent climate policy that at the time the US did not have at all. And I think people were concerned about things like competitiveness risks, leakage, those kinds of things. We designed our policy to minimize those impacts. So in some ways, I actually think we don't have to move kind of in direct lockstep with our closest international neighbor, although of course there are benefits to doing so, I recognize.
Tyler, any last comment on that? And clearly you guys are linked in with the American market.
Well, yeah, we are closely linked. We're part of the Columbia River Treaty, and we get, part of the. it's incredibly linked, in fact, because the Canadian allowance is managed by PowerX through the Columbia River, which Fortis BC's dams run. Anyways, that's an entire webinar in and of itself, the River Treaty. But just what I'd say, I think, yes, we need to be integrated. We also need to understand the limits of our own domestic policy. So one of the things I like to say is, the most consequential policy on, say, Canadian oil sands emissions is CAFE standards in the United States, right? Like that would be the most determinative factor in terms of how total oil sands emissions outputs. Canada, we can put a lot of regulations. We can do the ESCR or whatever, the OBPS on the output-based pricing systems on oil sands emissions. That'll all kind of matter at the margins. But if we want to make steep reductions, it's in the States really, where on the demand end, where that'll have the largest thing. So I think just kind of recognizing that we're in an integrated energy market. One of the things we talk about here in BC is why haven't BC's provincial emissions gone down? Well, that's because BC serves about 65% of the gas to the entire Pacific Northwest, right? And where has that gas gone? It's gone to support the shutdown of coal plants. It's also gone to, as you said in a previous line of inquiry, about supporting the integration of more renewables into the WEC system. And so, especially in terms of this resource import, export, and the emissions associated with that, we need to have a much more holistic view of like what this system is doing across borders. It's not really good enough to say, oh well, BC's gas production has doubled over the past 12 years. It's like, well, that's doubled in response to a larger mechanical system moving forward to address different factors, specifically in the power sector. And so I get sometimes a bit frustrated by people that are noticing a lack of progress within BC in a bubble. BC's not in a bubble, right? We are a resource producing and exporting jurisdiction to a much larger continental market.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to sort of wrap up what's been a really great kickoff for our workshop. We do have a lot of different markets here in Ontario, or sorry, in Canada. My Ontario focused bias showing there again, right? But that, there's a lot of potential and projects and work going on about how we're able to tie things together more nicely than we have. And perhaps this will be a very important part of the electrification story in Canada. So I'm going to pass it on to Brian to wrap up today's panel.
Well, great. Thanks, Adam. And I'd like to say thank you, Adam, great moderator. Nice movement of the questions and well appreciated. Thank you to all our speakers, Normand, Caroline, Tyler. We're really fortunate to have you today speaking to us. And also thank you very much to the attendees. Great questions. It was a great discussion, and nice to see a little difference of opinions and thoughts on this very difficult topic. So just as a closing note, I'd just like to remind you that we have our second session in the workshop series set up for Wednesday, October 13th, and that'll happen at 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. The topic of the session is transmission and distribution grid savings of the future, or services of the future, sorry. And we'll have some great speakers from Hydro One, the FERC, Federal Energy Regulatory Committee, Opus One, and the ISO. So if you haven't already, please register. Go to our website and register, and also let any of your friends and colleagues know of the workshop. So with that, I'd like to thank everybody again, and say till next time. I'll see you soon. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you, Mitch.
Thank you.